So we were discussing price discrimination through screening. Yes. Our initial analysis of price discrimination assumed that the seller can distinguish between various kinds of buyers, right? So the seller has full information about the buyer's willingness to pay and can indulge in price discrimination using that knowledge. In reality, of course, that is next to impossible. The willingness to pay for a product is private information to the buyer. But what we have been discussing are methods of screening by which high value and low value customers can be sorted out. Essentially, the trick is that the seller creates a menu of options, right? It creates multiple buying options for consumers, and it's constructed in a way that different types of buyers sort into different options. So that extracts the information and also allows the seller to make use of that information. So we were studying a very simple model, and the key to creating these options, as we saw in numerous examples that I mentioned, is to impose some sort of burden. Okay, so the lower priced option involves some extra burden which the buyer has to bear, like waiting for a long time, or spending a long time and effort in searching for coupons, that sort of thing. To remind you of the simple model we were studying, buyers have two possible values or willingness to pay, VH, VL. Proportions are alpha 1 minus alpha. And so if the seller doesn't want to do anything clever, just wants to charge one price, the seller will choose a price either VH or VL. We made the assumption that VL is the optimum price. So the high value types get away with some surplus in that situation. And the principal's profit is just simply VL. And then we moved on to screening. Okay, the principal or the seller now wants to create these two options. One is a high-priced option that involves no burden. You get the product immediately, don't have to find coupons, don't have to stand in line for ages. The other option will be a lower price discount option, but it carries the burden B. It requires, undergoing that onerous extra hassle. And what the seller will try to do is that he will try to create these two options in a way so that the high value customers choose the first option and low value budget conscious customers choose the second option. Otherwise, there's no point. If both are going to choose one of the two options, then the other option becomes redundant and plays no role. So to guarantee that, these two self-selection constraints have to be satisfied, right? High value type should find this more attractive. The low value type should find that other option more attractive. But the seller also has to make sure that, the buyer has a third option, which is to walk away, which is not to buy. So the seller has to make sure that buyers, neither type of customer exercises that quit option, not buying. So that gives us the two participation constraints. And the seller will try to maximize expected profit, which is the same as expected revenue because we have assumed no cost of production. Okay, so how do we solve a problem like this? Okay, I kind of gave you an outline at the end of the last lecture. Essentially, the strategy is as follows. Through a few steps of arguments, we can we can make the case that the problem doesn't change if we drop two of these four inequality constraints. Two of them are superfluous, redundant. We can take them away and the solution will remain the same. So we'll identify which two those are and we'll remove them. Then we can argue that the other two which remain, the other two constraints, have to bind at the optimum. They have to hold with equality. If not, the seller can redesign the two options in a way to increase his profits. So once we are down to two equality constraints, which they're just two linear equations, and we need to just solve them, and that'll give us the values of pH and PL. One assumption we'll make before we start on these steps is we'll assume this: VH minus VL greater than CH minus CL. So this is saying that, you know, the high value customers, they have a higher valuation for the product. They also have a higher cost. They bear a higher cost if they have to go through that burden, right? That long wait time or what have you. But the value differential is greater than the cost differential, right? So this kind of assumption is sometimes called single crossing property. We'll study this more in the second micro course. Anyway, so this is an assumption we'll make, which will give us interesting results. Okay, step one. The participation constraint of the high type is implied by the other constraints, and so it can be dropped. Okay, if the other constraints are satisfied, that implies that the participation constraint of the high type has to be satisfied. And so therefore it is a redundant constraint. Nothing is lost if we just drop it. So why is that? Well, here's the sketch of the proof. The outline of the argument is as follows. Suppose the participation constraint of the low type is satisfied, right? As well as the incentive constraint of the low type. So that means the low type will take this deal, the lower price deal with the burden attached to it, and will be happy to purchase under this deal, right? Now, what if the high type accepted the same deal? They face a higher cost. That's bad. They face a higher cost than the low type by this amount. But they also have a higher value of the product, which is this difference. And this difference is bigger. Okay. So if the high type were to accept exactly the deal that the low type is happily accepting, that would be better for them than not buying, for sure. Right? This deal carries a greater cost for the high type by this amount, but also greater value by this higher amount. And so if the low type is happy to accept this deal, so will the high type. So that means that as long as the low type's participation constraint is satisfied, so is the high type's, right? And so we can drop PCH from the analysis. Okay, step two. Participation constraint of the low type must be binding at the optimum. Okay, it must hold with equality. If not, there's a way for the seller to increase his profits. So why is that? Well, if the PCL is not binding, then what the seller can do is increase both the prices, right? The full price and the discount price by a small amount, epsilon. That'll obviously increase his profits. And we can show that it continues to satisfy all the constraints. Let's go back and look at the constraints. PCH has been dropped, right? As we argued that it's a redundant constraint. So the three relevant constraints which remain are ICH, ICL, and PCL. Okay. Now, suppose PCL is a strict inequality. Suppose this inequality is strict. Then if we increase both the prices by epsilon, notice that in the first inequalities, both the left-hand side and the right-hand side go up by epsilon, so that cancels out. So the first two inequalities continue to hold, even if both prices are raised by epsilon. And over here, the left-hand side will excuse me. And this also continues to be satisfied. Okay. So we don't violate any of the constraints, and profits go up. Well, this one, there is room for increasing PL a little bit because it's a strict inequality to begin with. So at least you can increase the prices by that amount. So step 2 tells us PCL is binding, it holds with an equality. Step 3, incentive constraint of the high type must be binding at the optimum, right? So this other constraint has to hold with equality if the seller is choosing his prices optimally. Why is that? Well, if not, increase pH by epsilon. Okay, once again, let's go back to the constraints. Keep in your mind that PCH has been thrown away, right? It's not relevant. And PCL is holding with equality. Okay. And now we are claiming that ICH has to hold with equality. So suppose that is not the case. Okay. So let's say ICH, incentive constraint of the high type, is strict. So this inequality is strict. Well, then if you increase pH a little bit, there's always room. Okay. If this is strictly less, then you can increase it a little bit without violating this inequality. And as far as the other inequality is concerned, it's helpful. If you increase pH, it becomes easier to satisfy this second inequality. So as long as this is a strict inequality, there's room to increase pH and increase the profit of the seller. Okay, so these two inequalities are binding, and as a last step, we can show that if these two are binding, the incentive constraint of the low type will be automatically satisfied. So that becomes a redundant constraint. And to see that, yes, so since this is binding, that means pH minus PL is equal to CH. Okay, but CH itself is bigger than CL, so then this other inequality immediately follows. Okay, so it's a bit intricate. You have to go through the steps and satisfy yourself that they're all correct. But after these 4 steps, we reach the conclusion that this problem, which initially was cast as this profit maximizing subject to 4 inequality constraints, it becomes equivalent to a profit maximization problem with 2 equality constraints. Okay, and since there are 2 variables, pH and PL, those 2 equality constraints immediately give a unique solution. So this is that unique solution. It's coming from binding incentive constraint of the high type and binding participation constraint of the low type. Okay. Now, The only remaining question is, remember that the seller could always keep things simple by just charging VL, right? Making sure that everybody buys it at the same uniform price. And that would give a profit of exactly VL. So the question is, this kind of trick, which leads to self-selection by the buyers, and different buyers buy through different options and reveal themselves that way. Is this method more profitable compared to the simple one price strategy of charging VL from everyone and selling to everyone? Well, we have to just calculate the expected profit, okay? So under this kind of screening strategy, what is expected profit? Expected profit is, for the high value guys, you get the pH, the equilibrium value of that we have calculated. This is the one. And for the low value customers, you get VL minus CL, and this is the term here. And if you simplify it, you get this, okay? So just charging a simple flat price of VL from everyone gives you VL, right? And this strategy gives you VL plus this extra term. So what matters is whether this extra term is positive or negative, okay? And as you can see, if alpha is high enough, this will be positive. So alpha high enough means what? It means there are enough high value customers out there. Yes. What this screening method does is that it allows the seller to identify the high value customers and charge more from them, more than VL, okay? They lose some money on the low value customers because they have placed some burden on them, which has reduced the value of the product to the low value customers, right? Previously, they were paying VL. Now they're paying only VL minus CL because of the burden that comes attached with the deal. If alpha is high enough, then the seller makes up for this lower revenue coming from low value customers by being able to screen out and charge a higher price from the high value guys. And if there's enough of them, high enough alpha, then it's a profitable strategy to screen this way, to price discriminate in this roundabout manner. Okay. Now, let me point out one thing, which is important. The high value customers, what is their maximum willingness to pay? It's VH. Okay. In this screening outcome, how much are they being charged? They're not being charged. They're limiting willingness to pay. They're being charged more than VL, but they are not charged as high as VH. Okay. In other words, the high value people, high value customers still retain some consumer surplus. They don't retain as much consumer surplus as would have been the case if the seller just adopted a simple one price strategy. Right? Relative to that case, the consumer surplus gets reduced because the seller is being clever in extracting some of that consumer surplus. Nevertheless, the high value customers don't lose their entire consumer surplus. Okay. If it was a full information world, if the seller knew who's a high value customer, then their consumer surplus would have been zero, right? Monopoly pricing would have made sure that the price would go all the way up to VH. Under this sort of asymmetric information and strategic screening of this sort, some consumer surplus remains. So this is called information rent. Okay. In models where agents hold some private information, even if they have no bargaining power, okay, just by virtue of the fact that they hold private information. What is the private information here? Private information is my willingness to pay. So as a consumer, even if I'm weak, the fact that only I know how far I can go, or what's the maximum I'll cough up to buy this product. That private information gives me some rent. That is to say, some consumer surplus, right? This is called information rent. And you'll see this sort of thing much more in your second course, but it's an overarching idea that information can be very, very powerful. If you're sitting on some information which other economic actors don't possess, then that exclusive information that you have gives you a lot of maneuvering room and economic power, right? And that's what we are seeing over here. Questions? No questions? Okay, so I just wanted to sort of, we talked quite a bit about price discrimination, so I wanted to give you a glimpse into how in the real world where consumers valuations are unknown to the seller to start with, how there can still be kind of roundabout ways of practicing price discrimination, and it corresponds to many observations that we see. Okay, let's move on to one or two remaining issues on monopoly. So the next thing I'll talk about is horizontal versus vertical mergers. Okay. Let me just confirm that you guys can hear me. You can hear me, right?
Yes, sir. We can hear you pretty well.
Class is very silent, so I'm getting a little confused.
There are very few people attending the class since we have a test tomorrow.
Yeah, that's what I guessed. So this all happens when the midterms come around. It's disruptive. Okay. Anyway, I'll get into this business of mergers. I mean, still there's 40 people, but it's a pretty silent group now. Okay, so now we have talked a lot about monopolies being bad, right? If monopolies are charging a single unit price, then we saw right at the beginning of the topic that it leads to underproduction, deadweight losses, and so on. Like the monopoly can price discriminate perfectly, then the inefficiency goes away, but there's no consumer surplus left. I mean, the distribution is very, very unequal. So one way or another, there's a problem. Yes. And so the thrust of government policy in most countries, for going back at least a century, is to try and prevent monopolies. Okay? Except in cases where, let's say, incentives have to be given for innovation, like new medicines and drugs. Except in those cases, for regular products, which already exist, the government tries to not allow the market to go towards a monopoly. Okay. Even a highly concentrated oligopoly is viewed as bad. To understand that, you'll have to look at oligopoly models, which you'll do in the next course. But certainly, if a market runs into a situation where all but one firm remains, only one firm remains, then we have a problem. That's the usual understanding. But what I'm going to discuss now is that the things are a little more nuanced than that. Okay. Of course, if there are two firms selling identical products and one of them quits or is bought up by the other firm, let's say. Okay. So let's say, we have our telecom market, and we have three players, Jio, Airtel, and Vodafone. And suppose Geo buys up the operations of both Airtel and Vodafone, then we have a monopoly, okay? And that'll be deemed as bad. Now, that's an example of what is called a horizontal merger. Firms selling identical or near identical products or services merge together. But you can think of mergers which are what may be called vertical mergers, for example. So, for example, there's a chip manufacturer like Intel or Qualcomm, and there's a PC manufacturer like Hewlett-Packard, let's say. So if Intel and Hewlett-Packard merge together and become a single firm, that's an example of a vertical merger, right? The two firms which merged were not selling substitutes, they were selling complements. The chip went into the making of the PC. So let's try to understand what happens when we have vertical instead of horizontal mergers. Right? Is that bad? Should antitrust authorities, competition bureaus, try to prevent vertical mergers also? Okay. So what do you think is the answer?
So I think it should be good for the market.
Why?
Because it's this one company which is producing the inputs as well, so their costs should ideally fall. I mean, the entire cost. That's why companies usually do this, right? That in-house production of inputs.
Yes.
I mean, if the total cost of production falls, then ideally they should decrease the price as well.
So they'll decrease the price.
Prima facie, that's what I believe. But I mean, I'm not very sure if that's the correct answer.
Anyone else?
So, but generally the chips of Intel are used by other manufacturers also. I mean, it's a raw material for other companies also, so they could basically cut their supply.
Yeah. So let's keep our thought exercise simple here by saying that, well, both of these were monopolists. Okay, so Intel was the only chip manufacturer and Hewlett-Packard was the only PC manufacturer. The case where, they were part of a cluster of oligopolistic firms is more complicated, so we won't analyze that. For the purpose of our understanding, let's assume they're both monopolists to begin with for their respective products. Yeah. This is, you could also think of a Discom merging with a company which produces the power, right? Discoms like BSES, they buy the power normally, and they get it to the households. But suppose they have merged with the power plant, the company owning the power plant. Okay. So the issue is how will the merger affect their pricing strategies, as I think the previous comment was. So let's analyze that systematically. Okay. So I'll set up a very simple model here to understand this. So let's say there are two products. Okay. There's what is called a downstream product X. Think of that as furniture. And there's an upstream product Y. Think of that as wood, which goes into making the furniture. Yeah. And we'll keep things very, very simple. We'll assume that there's a fixed coefficient technology. So to make 1 unit of furniture, you need 1 unit of wood, along with fixed amounts of labor and other things. So initially, each of these goods is controlled by a separate monopolist. So there's a furniture monopolist, IKEA, and there's a logging company which has a monopoly on supplying wood. And let's say their marginal costs are constant, CX and CY respectively. So the logging company has this marginal cost of getting 1 unit of wood to whoever uses it. And the furniture company has this cost of production. So its overall cost will be this CX plus whatever price they have to pay for the 1 unit of wood that they will buy for each unit of furniture, right? So their marginal cost will be CX plus that extra item. For the final good, namely furniture, the inverse demand function is PX. Okay, and so the revenue function is this. Okay, and we'll assume that it's downward sloping. Normally, they are downward sloping. So the revenue function is downward sloping. And just as a matter of notation, Q is the price charged by the upstream monopolist, the logging company selling the wood. Okay, Q, of course, will be endogenous. So how do we solve this model? So we want to do two exercises. One is first, assume they're separate monopolists, figure out what will happen, what will be the final price, and then we'll let them merge and see what the merged single monopolist, what their pricing will be and how much they'll sell. Okay, so when the two monopolists are separate, how do we solve? Well, we have to use a reasoning called backward induction, right? Basically, we take an arbitrary price Q. So the logging company has chosen a Q, whatever that is, and taking that Q as given, the price of wood that has been set, the downstream monopolist, namely the furniture company, will solve this problem, right? They'll choose their X to maximize their profit. How much wood do they want to buy and how much furniture do they want to sell? It's 1-to-1, so they're interchangeable. So they want to maximize this, okay? From their perspective, Q is a given. Q is a price that has been set by the logging company upstream. So first order condition is marginal revenue equals marginal cost. For them, marginal cost is CX plus Q, right? CX is all the other costs like labor. Q is the price of wood. Standard condition, right? So now we go a step back. This first order condition essentially gives us a derived demand function, so to speak, for the upstream guy, namely the logging company. They know that once they set a Q, how much of their product the other firm will want to buy will be given by this equation. Okay, so they'll take that as given in deciding what price to charge, where to set Q. So this is one way to set up that problem. Okay, the logging company, the upstream firm, will maximize their profit, which is this, right? Y is how much they're selling, times Q, the price they've set, minus this. Since we want to do the maximization with respect to quantity, what we can do now here is that we can go back, look at this equation, which is the source of the derived demand function. So Q can be expressed as R prime minus CX, right? So that's what I've done here. Replace Q by this. Okay. So now it becomes a standard profit maximization problem with quantity being the choice. Okay. So you take the first order condition with respect to Y. So that is this with where all I've done is switched Y for X. Remember, Y and X at the end of the day will be the same. Okay. Y is the amount of wood, X is the amount of furniture given the fixed coefficient technology. Y and X will match at the end of the day. So I calculated the, set the derivative equal to 0, but instead of Y, I switched to writing X, and I put an X double star because this is what the outcome is going to be when the monopolists are separate entities. They're different firms. Okay. So then the volume of output will be given by this equation. R prime plus this X times R double prime equals the sum of the two marginal costs. Okay, so let's hold this in place. Let's keep it in reserve. And now let's switch to the situation where the two firms have merged. Now they're a single monopolist who do the logging and make the furniture in-house. Okay. So what is this combined firms maximization problem? Well, this is what they're maximizing. Okay. Yes, everybody see that?
Yes, sir.
So there's a simple first order condition. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost, which is the sum of these two, Cx plus Cy. So that determines X star. So X star is the output after merger. X double star is the output before merger, right? If merger didn't happen, if they remain separate. So the question is, which is bigger? And now, to understand that, we need to compare this equation versus that equation. Notice that on the right-hand side of both the equations, we have the same thing, Cx plus Cy, and that's a constant. On the left-hand side, there's the R prime, the marginal revenue term is there in both equations. In the first equation, which applies to the pre-merger scenario, there's this extra term on the left-hand side. And this extra term is negative. Yes, because the marginal revenue curve we have assumed is downward sloping. So this extra term is negative. Do I have a picture? Okay. So then we can conclude that X star is greater than X double star. In other words, if you want to see that, you can easily see that by drawing a picture. So so here's a line, Cx plus Cy. Okay. On this axis, I'm measuring output, X or Y. Now, this is my marginal revenue curve. Okay. So wherever that intersects, that's the X star, right? Post-merger, the single consolidated firm will choose this value. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Now, if the merger didn't happen, then remember the equation we just had on the slides? It's R prime plus a negative term, right? Involving R double prime, which means that the left-hand side in that case is a curve which is lower. And that curve's intersection with this combined cost line gives us X double star. This is the output that would take place if there was no merger. Right? And you can see that if the merger happened, output will actually expand. And therefore, price of the final product, furniture, will actually fall because then sliding along the demand curve. Higher production, higher sales, lower prices. Okay, so is the merger good or bad?
So from consumers' perspective, it's good.
And for the firm's perspective,
It's good for the firms as well because we're reducing the inefficiency which came earlier while they were buying from the wood manufacturer because they were the monopoly.
right? So what happens to the profits of the industry as a whole before merger versus after merger?
So it'll increase.
It can only increase. Why is that? What's a quick?
So because both consumer surplus and producer surplus is increasing.
No, why is producer surplus increasing? That's the
So
question.
because at the end of the day, they are maximizing their profits, right?
That's right.
So they were maximizing it before and they're maximizing it now.
One of the things that they could have done is they could have not changed anything after the merger. They could have continued to produce whatever the production was before merger, and that would have preserved their profits, right? Their sort of combined profits. So when they change the output level, it can only lead to higher profits. Okay. So post-merger, the industry is more profitable. The overall profits have increased, and consumers are better off. They're getting the product at lower prices. So this is an example of a Pareto improvement. The merger creates a Pareto improvement. So you can see that the effect is dramatically opposite. Okay, if Hewlett-Packard and Dell merge together, two firms selling substitutes, close substitutes, that has a negative impact. That will lead to certainly lower consumer surplus, but also lower social surplus and so on. But this vertical merger not only increases social surplus, it's actually a Pareto improvement. It's a win-win for everyone. What is the intuition? Why is this happening? Anyone?
So is it because the price charged by the input selling firm was higher than their costs earlier? But if one firm is producing the inputs itself, it will only account for the cost.
Yeah, but is there some overarching principle that we can allude to? Simple overarching principle, which we see repeatedly in many different contexts. See, the intuition of the externality and what it does to the actions of various agents. I've mentioned this before when we're talking of, externalities, public goods, etc. What is the key idea? The key idea is in those activities which involve negative externalities like pollution, privately motivated agents overdo the activity, right? They do too much because they're not counting part of the cost they're imposing on others. That's why without Pigouvian taxes and other corrections, polluting industries will overproduce relative to what is socially optimal. Yes? So when negative externalities are involved, agents overdo or do too much of the activity. When positive externalities are involved, it's exactly the opposite. Okay, I can do something whose part of the benefit I'm not counting. Part of the benefit falls on other people, not the cost, the benefit. And that's why I do too little. Example, vaccination. Okay. Or being conscientious about, garbage disposal and a host of a bunch of things. So when positive externalities are involved, private action is too little. Negative externalities, private action is excessive. Okay. Now let's come to this context. Can we think of a so let's say in terms of pricing, in terms of pricing the intermediate input, namely this wood. Okay. What kind of externality, when the two firms are separate, what is the nature of the externality in terms of pricing?
Negative.
Negative. When the logging company raises the price of wood, it may increase its own profits, but it's imposing a harm on the profitability of the downstream firm, the furniture company. Yes, and it's not taking that into account. So that means it ends up pricing too high. And when they merge, this thing is internalized, and so the implicit pricing becomes lower, so to speak, right? So pricing of wood involves a negative externality from one firm to the other. And that's why it was excessive, and that's why there was this inefficiency. Okay. This is sometimes called the double marginalization of monopoly. That if a product has to come through several stages, then if there's a monopolist at every stage of production, then each monopolist is slapping on some monopoly markup, and there are multiple such monopoly markups, right? If all of them combine and become one consolidated monopolist, then there's the monopoly markup and distortion falls only once, not several times. And that's why the market becomes more efficient overall. Question. Nilavo raised your hand. Yes, Nilavo.
So in the second point, could you repeat why you have replaced y by x double star?
Because I can always do that, because of the fixed coefficient technology, y will be equal to x, right?
Okay.
So I just you write down the first order condition with respect to y. Okay, that will be exactly this equation with y instead of x.
Okay.
Then you can switch y by x.
So can this concept be applied to corruption as well? So when
Yes.
there are different levels.
Absolutely.
Sorry. Yeah.
That's a good analogy. There are arguments that, the formation of nation states, for example, in Europe, improved economic efficiency. Because before that, there were, the political units were too small and splintered. Okay, so if a product was going, let's say, from Central Asia to Western Europe, so the merchants were carrying these goods. Like every few kilometers, there was a new authority and they had to pay a new set of taxes. Yes. And so the combined effect of those layer upon layer of taxes imposed by different authorities was quite crippling for business. Yeah. Same for corruption, in corruption, competition is a bad thing, one can argue, that if there are multiple 10 different desks where you have to pay bribes, right, that all builds up, and lots of people won't seek the thing in the first place, whatever they're seeking, for which they're paying bribes. Maybe it's a business permit. Whereas if all these different corrupt officials became kind of centralized, right? Well, it's still bad. We wish there was no corruption, but at least the monopolistic market structure is better as far as corruption is concerned compared to competition. So things turn on its head.
Yeah. So
now, the last thing which I had on the slides is basically carrying forward this same idea essentially, and looking at it in another context, which is tax harmonization. And this is relevant to the debate about, something like the GST. Okay. So What are the pros and cons of GST? Well, there are many different things. Right? Here, I'll talk about one thing, which is, there are multiple. What does GST do? GST do, it's a one-stop taxation, indirect tax. Yes. Instead of various state governments and various local authorities and the central government, they each imposing their own taxes. There's a single tax collected by the central government. Rates are decided at that level. And then the revenues are shared by the various tax authorities. So it's almost like a merger of the various tax authorities, yeah, instead of fiscal competition between them. Now, is that good for economic efficiency or not? There's some reason to think that there's a good thing. So to illustrate that, I have this very simple model again here, and I'll quickly go through it because the nature of the thing is very similar. So let's say there's a linear demand curve for a product, yes. And let's say supply is horizontal at some price, P hat. Okay. There's some constant marginal cost of production. So the center chooses so there are two taxation authorities, the central government and the state government. And let's say they choose their tax rates sequentially, which sometimes is not a bad assumption. Same conclusion if they chose their taxes simultaneously. Anyway, let's allow for sequential choices. So the center announces a tax rate, TFC. Okay, everybody learns that. It comes out in the budget speech, the finance minister, February 1. And then state governments choose their own tax rates, TS. Okay. This is pre-GST. It is before a merger of the taxation authorities. Both governments aim to maximize their own tax revenues, of course, right? And center and state do not coordinate their tax policies. They just choose the tax rates which they think will serve their own interest best. Okay, so how do we solve for the outcome? Exactly like the way we looked at the upstream downstream monopolist problem. Okay, you start from the end. You look at the taxation authority who makes the last choice, namely the state government. So when the state government is choosing its tax rate, it knows what the center's tax rate is and takes that given as a parameter, right? TC. And they're maximizing their own tax collection this way. Okay, so a very simple quadratic equation. So first order condition, derivative equal to 0. So that gives you this. This is what is sometimes called the reaction function. Okay, for every please. Somebody has a microphone.
देख के रह जाऊं हमारा टोपी से क्या मुझे लग रहा है बंदर देख रहा ऊपर
Kunal, your microphone is on.
ऊपर जाया करो तो वो एलोवेरा का पेड़ में से पानी खिलाया करो.
Okay. So this is what is called the reaction function. Okay. What does this tell us? It tells us what the state's optimal choice of tax rate will be as a function of the tax rate that the center chose earlier. Yes. And you can see there's a negative relationship. So if the center raises its taxes, the state to some extent accommodates by lowering its taxes, but not one for one. Okay, as you can see, this slope is minus half. So if the center raises its tax by rupee, the state will cut their own taxes by 50%, but the overall combined tax rate will still go up, not go down. Okay, now we know the state's reaction function. Now let's go back a step and look at the center's problem. And so the center has a very astute finance minister. The finance minister figures out, for whatever tax rate she chooses, what the response of the state is going to be, right? So the center is aware of this reaction function. Okay. So the center's choice of tax rate takes the reaction function into account, takes into account that the state will respond to the center's choice in a particular way. So we insert the reaction function we calculated over here, it's linear, into this center's maximization problem. And then we do the maximization, first derivative equals 0. That gives an optimal tax rate for the center, which is this. And now you can go back into the reaction function of the state, plug in the center's tax rate, optimal tax rate. And from that, you can calculate what the state's tax choice will be at the end of the day. Okay, which turns out to be this, half of the center's tax rate in this linear model. Okay. Now the question is, suppose they move to some GST kind of regime. So there are no two separate tax authorities. There's a single tax authority who sets one single rate and collects taxes for both center and states and the various stakeholders here. So that GST-like council will choose its tax rate based on this maximization, right? T times, this is the quantity in the market, given linear demand. And the optimal tax rate, easy to calculate, this amount. What's interesting is, you go back to the previous regime, where there were separate taxation authorities. If you add up these two tax rates, centers and states, you get 3/4 times this A minus BP divided by B, right? And here, when you have the combined taxation authority, the GST council, it is half times A minus BP divided by B. So the combined tax rate here, so the optimal tax rate here is lower than the combined tax rate in the earlier regime. Okay. Now, what does that imply? What is the implication of that? Consumers and businesses will face lower overall tax rates after this tax harmonization, right? So they'll be better off. The governments will raise more revenues because, after all, they could have kept, after formation of the GST Council, they could have kept the combined tax rate to be this sum, but they didn't. If they kept it this sum, they would have raised the same amount of money as before. They wouldn't suffer any losses. But the fact that they lowered it means that they must have lowered it to get more revenues. So again, there's a win-win. Consumers are better off, businesses are better off, and taxation authorities, the governments are better off. They collect more revenues. Yes? So the competition between different taxation authorities was actually eating into their profits. Once again, you can think of the negative externality as the intuitive fulcrum over here. Right? When the center raises its taxes, it has its own calculations, revenues, but it imposes a negative effect on the state government's revenue prospects, right? Because it's shrinking business, it's shrinking sales. So the state government is collecting less money when the center's tax rates are raised. Likewise, when the state government's tax rates are raised, it has a similar negative externality on the central government. And when they're separate entities, they are not counting these negative externalities, they're imposing on each other. And that's why they have their tax rates too high from a more national, holistic point of view. And if they come together into a single GST-like council, this negative externality will now be counted and corrected for. And that'll bring down the tax rates, and that'll be better for everyone. So that's one of the reasons for argument for tax harmonization. Yeah. So monopolies in some situations are not bad, actually. That's questions. No questions?
In the case where there is horizontal merger of firms, then the positive externality which we had earlier, now it is gone. Therefore, the consumer surplus is down. Is that the reason?
No. Positive externality is now counted. It's not like it goes up in smoke. The benefit goes up in smoke. The benefit is still there. Previously, the positive externality that the firms were imposing on each other was not being counted. After the merger, it is being counted because after all, they have become different divisions of the same company. And so they correct their decisions. When they were not counting the positive externality, they were underdoing the activity. Yes. Once they merge and become their interests become totally aligned, they change their decisions. They take into account the positive externality. Right.
So for the firms who are producing substitute products, if they merge, then the consumer surplus will go down, right?
I see. So you're talking of substitutes. Okay, let's review that case. Okay, so why is it exactly the opposite when they have substitutes? Yes. So when they are selling substitutes, they're if one of the firms raises its price, it imposes a positive externality on the other firm. Yes. When one firm makes its product more expensive, it sends some customers towards the other firm. So
yes, sir.
Price increases have a positive externality. And that's why they will price too low from their joint interests perspective, right? They'll end up pricing too low. So when they merge, they take into account their positive externality on each other, and so they'll raise the price. Okay. Now, for those, so raising the price has a negative impact on consumers. So both in the complements and in the substitutes case, the merger will enable the two firms, the merging firms, to increase their joint profits. But if you follow the externality intuition, you'll see that in the substitutes case, the way they incorporate, the way they count the externality is by raising the prices. And in the complements case, they do it by lowering the prices. So therefore, consumers only benefit in the complements case, not in the substitutes case.
Okay, sir, got it.
Yes, Nila. Yeah.
So I have an observation that after the merger, the firms produce at a lower price and higher quantity. So we can say that after mergers, the marginal product of the factors of production reduces after the merger.
No, why will marginal product? That's a technological condition. That has nothing to do with, pricing. Marginal product remains the same. It's just a question of, how much is socially optimal to produce, whether they're producing it or not.
Okay, so I need to think about it again.
Yeah.